The numbers on the microwave read 11,047 p.m. when I finally sat down at the kitchen table and let the silence settle around me like something solid. There were 2 coffee mugs on the counter. One was mine. The other had a faint pink lipstick ring on the rim that I hadn't noticed this morning. Or maybe I had, and just looked past it the way I'd been looking past a lot of things. My wife's name was Vivian. Past tense feels wrong to say out loud, but that's what she was now. I was 51 years old, and I was sitting in a kitchen that suddenly felt like it belonged to a stranger. It started the way these things always start. Not with a single explosion, but with a long series of small sounds you convince yourself you're mishearing. Vivian had been distant since spring, not cold exactly. More like a window left slightly open in a room where the heat is running. You feel it, but you tell yourself it's nothing. She started going to the gym at 6 in the morning, which was new. She started laughing differently on the phone, softer, like she was being careful about volume. She started talking about a man named Derek, the way you talk about a song you can't get out of your head, offhandedly, repeatedly, like you're not even aware you're doing it. Derek was her colleague at the marketing firm where she'd worked for 3 years. According to Vivian, he'd started his own consulting spin-off on the side, had clients in 3 states, drove a car that I personally knew cost more than our first house. I never disliked Derek. I never had a reason to. I was a project manager for a mid-sized construction company, had been for 17 years. I made a good living. I was not Derek, but I hadn't thought that was ever the point. I turned 50 while we were still married. She bought me a watch. We went to dinner. It was a normal evening. 6 weeks later, she told me she needed space to figure out what she really wanted from her life, which is the kind of sentence that sounds like it's about her, but is entirely about you. She didn't leave right away. We spent 3 weeks in the same house, talking around each other, and then one Tuesday I came home from a job site earlier than expected and found her in the driveway loading a suitcase into the back of Derek's car. She saw me and her face didn't go guilty the way I expected. It went tired, like she'd been dreading the conversation for so long that my actually showing up for it was almost a relief. I said her name. She said she was sorry, that she'd meant to talk to me before this, that she cared about me deeply, but that she and Derek had something she couldn't walk away from. Derek stayed in the car. I remember noticing that. I remember thinking that whatever kind of man he was the kind who stayed in the car. I didn't yell, I didn't block the driveway. I stepped back, and I let her finish loading the suitcase, and I watched his car pull out, and I stood there till the taillights disappeared around the corner, and then I walked inside and poured myself a glass of water and drank the whole thing standing at the sink. The first call I made was to my friend Tom. We'd been friends since college. Tom was a family law attorney now, had been for 22 years, and when I told him what had just happened, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Come to my office tomorrow morning, first thing. And don't talk to her about finances before you do." That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the table and I opened my laptop and I went through every joint account, every shared credit card, every subscription tied to both our names. It was methodical. It felt like the only thing I could control. By 2 in the morning, I had a complete picture of our shared financial life, and I had already begun to see that some of the edges didn't line up. Vivian had made 3 transfers from our joint savings in the past 6 weeks, each one just under the threshold that would have triggered an automatic notification to me. Total, $14,000. The transfers went to an account I didn't recognize. I photographed the screen. I kept scrolling. Tom's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown with a view of the river. He poured coffee and he listened without interrupting. And when I was done, he laced his fingers together on the desk and said, "Tell me about the transfers." I showed him the screenshots. He looked at them for a long time and said, "This changes things considerably. Here's the thing about having a good lawyer who is also a genuine friend. He tells you what you need to hear, not what you want to." Tom told me that pressing criminal charges for the transfers would be legally possible, but strategically unwise at this stage, because the moment it became a criminal matter, it would also become a prolonged and expensive one. And in the meantime, the divorce proceedings would slow to a crawl while we waited on a separate investigation. "Better," he said, "to document everything now. File a detailed accounting as part of the divorce discovery, and let the forensic paper trail work in our favor during asset division." "That's not letting her off the hook," he said. "That's choosing the right battlefield." "I want them to hurt," I told him. not just be inconvenienced. Actually hurt. Tom looked at me evenly. Then he said, "Let's make sure you're protected first. The hurting will follow on its own." That afternoon, my sister-in-law called me. Her name is Paula, Vivian's younger sister, and she opened with, "I'm so sorry, Marcus and I knew she meant it." She said she'd tried to talk Vivian out of this, that she'd seen it coming for months and hadn't known how to tell me, that she was angry at herself for that. I asked her about Derek. She went quiet in a way that meant she knew more than she'd volunteered. Turns out Derek's consulting business was largely built on a foundation of borrowed credibility. He'd named a few recognizable brands as clients on his website without their consent. His offices, there was one downtown location he used for meetings, were rented by the day through a shared workspace app. His car was leased. His credit was, according to Paula, who had heard this from Vivian herself during a phone call. Paula wasn't supposed to remember, stretched to the limit. Vivian knew some of this, Paula thought. Maybe not all of it. She believed in the story of Derek more than she'd bothered to verify it. I thanked Paula. I told her she had nothing to apologize for. Then I sat with what she'd said for a long time, turning it over. Vivian had left a stable life for a performance. She'd looked at what we had and decided it was lesser because it didn't come with a leased car and a rented office, and a man who stayed in the car while his girlfriend loaded her suitcase. The house felt different after she left. Not emptier, exactly. More accurate, like I was finally seeing the floor plan as it actually was. I changed the locks the next day and updated the security system codes and called the bank to flag the joint account, and within 72 hours, I had drawn a clear line around what was mine and what was ours, and what would need to be divided. She called 6 times in the first week. I let all 6 go to voicemail. Her messages moved through stages like weather. First apologetic, then explanatory, then briefly aggressive, then apologetic again. In the last one, she said she just needed to pick up a few things from the house and could I please just let her do that without making it into a whole situation. I forwarded all 6 to Tom. My son, Nathan, was 24 and lived in Phoenix. He called when he heard. He didn't ask me to reconcile with his mother, which I respected. He asked me if I was okay, which I answered honestly. I was functioning. He said that's not what I asked, and I told him I appreciated that and that I'd call him more. I meant it. The weeks after the separation have a certain underwater quality when I look back on them. I went to work. I managed projects. I ate dinner at the kitchen table alone and found that I didn't mind it as much as I'd expected to. I started running again, something I'd stopped in my 40s because my knees had started complaining, and my knees still complained, but I ran anyway. I lost 12 pounds. I slept better than I had in 2 years. Some mornings, I'd catch myself reaching for my phone to text her something mundane, some little piece of information about the day, and then I'd realize I had no reason to, and I'd feel not grief exactly, but a kind of weather passing through. Through Paula, I heard updates about the Vivian and Derek situation. They were living in his apartment downtown, the one he'd rented under a 2-year lease that, as it turned out, he was already behind on by the 2nd month. The consulting clients he'd named on his website had sent cease and desist letters. 2 of his actual clients, there were some, smaller ones, had pulled their contracts after the reputational noise. Vivian had started working extra hours to cover what she called their shared expenses, which I understood to mean she was covering his rent. I should have felt satisfied. I mostly did, but there was something else working under the surface, something darker, and it announced itself about 2 months into the separation in the form of a text message from someone named Greg. Greg was my oldest friend. We had grown up 3 houses apart in the same neighborhood, had gone to the same high school, had stayed in contact through moves and marriages and children and all the ordinary distances life creates. Greg knew Vivian. He'd been at our wedding. He was one of perhaps 4 people in the world I would have called without hesitation at any hour for any reason. The text said, "Hey man, I heard about everything. I'm really sorry. We should get a beer. Been too long." Normal message. Completely normal. I would have agreed and moved on except that something about the timing snagged in me. How had he heard? Not from me. I hadn't told him yet. Vivian and Greg had never been particularly close. So who was the link? I called Paula. She went quiet in that way again. She said, "Marcus, I don't know if I should be the one to tell you this." I told her I'd rather hear it from her than find out another way. She said that about 4 months before Vivian left. She'd had coffee with Greg. More than once. Vivian had been confiding in him about being unhappy in the marriage. About Derek. About wanting more than she felt she had with me. And Greg had told her, according to what Vivian had repeated to Paula afterward, that she deserved to be happy. That sometimes people outgrow each other. And that if Marcus wasn't giving her what she needed, maybe that said something about the fit. He'd encouraged her. My oldest friend had sat across a coffee table from my wife and told her that leaving me was a reasonable option, maybe even the right one, and then he'd sent me a text saying, "Hey man, I'm really sorry." I put my phone down and walked to the window and looked at the backyard for a long time. The anger that came up was different from what I'd felt about Vivian. Vivian's betrayal had been a kind of leaving. This was something that had happened inside what I'd believed was a safe room. I didn't call Greg back. I called Tom instead. Tom listened. When I was done, he asked, "What do you want to do?" "I want to know everything," I said. "And I want to be very careful about what I do with it." What I did first was nothing. I let Greg send 2 more texts over the next 3 weeks, both casual, both friendly, and I let them sit unanswered. In the meantime, I had a conversation with an old coworker of Greg's, a man named Bill who'd left the company Greg worked for under circumstances Greg had described to me years ago as a personality conflict. Bill described them differently. He described a situation involving a client account, disputed commissions, and Greg's name coming up in an internal review. I filed that away. Then, at Nathan's suggestion, I agreed to meet him halfway. He flew into Denver for a long weekend, and we spent 3 days doing very little except eating barbecue and watching baseball and talking the way fathers and sons don't always get the opportunity to talk. He was perceptive in the way young people sometimes are, uncluttered by the weight of years of choosing to look away. He said, "Dad, I've watched you be decent your whole life, and I want you to stay that way. Not for Mom, for you." I told him I was trying. He looked at me like he wasn't entirely convinced. The settlement conference happened on a Thursday in October. Tom and I arrived early. Vivian and her attorney were already in the conference room when we were shown in, and the 4 of us sat down at opposite sides of a long table and proceeded to spend 2 hours negotiating the division of a life. Vivian looked tired. Her hair was different. She was wearing a blazer I didn't recognize, something new she'd bought for the occasion, and there was a tightness around her eyes that hadn't been there a year ago. Derek had not come with her. I noted that. Her attorney opened with a proposal that was aggressively favorable to Vivian. Tom waited until the man was finished and then set our documentation on the table. The $14,000 in transfers, the bank records, the timeline, the account they'd gone to, which Tom had traced to a joint account Vivian had opened with Derek 3 weeks before she left. Vivian's attorney looked at his client. Vivian looked at the table. The room got very quiet. Tom explained in the measured tone he used when he wanted to be absolutely clear that we were not filing criminal charges at this time, but that we were prepared to include the full documentation in discovery, which would become part of the public court record. He said this without drama. He let the information sit there. Vivian's attorney asked for a 15-minute recess. When they came back, the proposal had changed considerably. I won't detail every line of the final settlement because most of it is what you'd expect after a 23-year marriage with a documented breach of financial trust. I kept the house. I kept the quarry. I kept the car. She received her personal property, her individual savings, and no spousal support, which her attorney had initially requested and then quietly removed from the revised proposal during the recess. Vivian and I did not speak directly during the conference. At one point, she looked at me across the table, and I looked back, and there was a long moment where I think she was waiting for me to say something that would soften the room, and I didn't. Outside afterward, on the sidewalk, she came toward me while Tom was speaking to her attorney at the curb. She said, "Marcus, I know I hurt you. I know this isn't what you deserved." I said I appreciated that. She said Derek and I, she stopped, started again. "Things have been hard." I said I was sorry to hear that. I wasn't, but it seemed like the right amount to give her. She said, "Do you think you'll ever forgive me?" I thought about it. I said, "I think eventually I'll stop being angry." I don't know if that's the same thing. She nodded. She looked like she might say something else. Then she walked back to her attorney and I walked back to Tom and we went to get lunch at a place around the corner where they had good soup. And Tom ordered a beer and raised it slightly in my direction and said, "You handled that well." The Greg situation I handled differently. I waited until December, after the divorce was finalized, and then I invited him to meet me for that beer he'd been suggesting for months. We went to the bar we'd gone to for years, the one near the old neighborhood with the sticky booths and the bartender who still remembered our names. Greg seemed relieved that I'd finally reached out. He was warm, familiar, the way someone is when they've been carrying low-grade guilt, and take your warmth as evidence that they've gotten away with it. We talked for an hour about normal things. At some point, he shook his head and said, "Man, I still can't believe Vivian did that. You don't deserve that." I said, "No, I don't." I let the silence run for a moment. I said, "Funny thing, Greg. I heard you two had coffee a few times. Before she left." He didn't go pale. He was better than that. He went carefully neutral, which is a more sophisticated reaction and also a more revealing one. He said, "Yeah, once or twice she reached out. You know how it is." I said, "I heard you told her she deserved to be happy." He said, "Well, everyone deserves to be happy, Marcus." I said, "That's true. I also deserve to have a friend who came and talked to me if he thought my marriage was in trouble, instead of talking to my wife about her options." He started to explain. I let him go for about 45 seconds, and then I set my beer down and I said, "Greg, I've known you 40 years. I know when you're explaining, and I know when you're constructing. This is the second one." He stopped. I said, "I want you to understand something. I'm not going to make a scene tonight. I'm not going to call your wife. I'm not going to contact your employer about the client account situation from a few years back, which I know more about than you think I do. What I'm going to do is finish this beer, stand up, and stop knowing you. That's it. That's all I've got for you." He started to say my name. I drank the rest of my beer. I put cash on the table for both of us. I stood up, put my coat on, and I walked out. The cold hit me on the sidewalk, and I stood there for a moment in it, breathing. There was no satisfaction in it, not the clean kind, more like the feeling after a wound has finally closed. Not healed, just closed. Winter was strange. I was alone in a house that was genuinely, functionally mine for the first time in decades, and I moved through it differently than I had when it was ours. I rearranged furniture. I painted the living room a color she never would have agreed to. I made Nathan a standing invitation to come stay whenever he wanted, and he took me up on it twice in January alone. Paula checked in regularly. Through her, I learned that Derek's consulting business had finally collapsed entirely under the weight of a lawsuit filed by one of the companies he'd misrepresented on his website. He and Vivian had moved out of the downtown apartment, couldn't afford the lease, and were reportedly staying with Derek's mother while he figured out next steps. Vivian had taken a second job, the Instagram account where she'd been posting their life together. Brunches, weekend trips, photos that I recognized as the performance they were, had gone quiet in November. I didn't look at it. Paula told me anyway, and I appreciated that she thought I needed to know, and I set it aside. There was a woman I met in late February. Her name was Carol. She was a physical therapist, 53, divorced 8 years with 2 adult children and an opinion about everything, and a laugh you could hear from across a restaurant. We met at a dinner party at a mutual friend's house and talked for 3 hours, standing in the kitchen while the rest of the party moved around us. We were not in a hurry. Neither of us had any particular appetite for hurrying anymore. We had dinner the following week, and then dinner again the week after that, and it was easy in a way that reminded me that not everything requiring effort is worth the effort. I'm not going to tell you I became a better man through all of this. I don't think that's true, exactly. I think I became a more honest one. I stopped extending the kind of ambient generosity that asks nothing in return and receives nothing and calls the emptiness stability. I started paying attention to what things actually were instead of what I'd decided they should be, the darkness I mentioned. The part of me that had been cataloging what I knew about Greg's professional history, that had forensically traced every dollar Vivian moved, that had sat in a settlement conference and felt something cold and clean when her attorney went pale looking at our documentation. That part didn't disappear. I still live with it. I don't think it's something that goes away. I think you learn to be honest about its presence instead of dressing it up as righteousness. Nathan called me in March. He asked how I was, and I said, honestly, I think I'm okay. Real okay, not functional okay. He said he was glad. Then he said, Dad, I have to ask you something. He said, when you found out about Greg, did you want to do more than what you did? I said yes. I said there was a window of maybe 6 weeks where I could feel myself wanting to, and I chose not to, and I'm not entirely sure if that was wisdom or just fatigue. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I think the fact that you know the difference matters. The divorce had been final for 4 months by then. The house had new paint on the walls and new locks on the doors, and a coffee maker that only needed 1 mug. I ran 3 mornings a week. Tom and I had lunch on the first Friday of every month. Carol and I had started spending weekends together with an unhurried ease that felt, more than anything, like choosing instead of settling. I am not happy the way I was happy at 25, which was largely the happiness of not knowing what there was to lose. I am something quieter than that. Something that can sit at a kitchen table at 11:47 at night without needing the silence to be something other than what it is. The numbers on the microwave change. The coffee mugs get washed. Some mornings I look at the color on the living room wall that she never would have agreed to, and I feel something I don't have an exact word for. Not victory. Not peace, quite. Something like, I am still here and I chose this, and that matters more than I used to think it did. They made me into something harder. I will give them that. I am not grateful for it, but I am not pretending it didn't happen either. You can spend a long time deciding whether the person the fire made you is someone worth being. I am still deciding. But I am deciding on my own terms, in my own house, with the curtains I chose and the quiet I earned, and at 51 years old, I have learned that this is not a small thing. This is the only thing.